welcome everyone. My name is Saurabh Arora. I will be moderating this session on Technofixes, colonialism, and resistance. I myself work on issues of agricultural sustainability very widely at Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex. And I have a distinguished group of panelists with me today here. There's supposed to be three of us, but we're having problems with three of the panelists and four of us, including me. But we're having problems with connection from the Philippines. So I'll start perhaps by introducing our first panelist, Ruchi Shroff. Ruchi is director of Navdanya International. She's based in Rome, while Navdanya, as many of you might know, is headquartered in India, where Navdanya has done path-breaking work for over 30 years on agricultural biodiversity, traditional knowledges, health and nutrition, as well as wider equity and social justice issues. Ruchi herself has worked on seed freedom and food sovereignty, as well as resistance to genetic modification, biopiracy, and free trade agreements. Ruchi is interested in revealing the true costs of the industrial food system paradigm, particularly in terms of agricultural biodiversity and other aspects of sustainability. And for more than a decade now, Ruchi has been active with a wide range of social movements on environmental issues, as well as minority and indigenous rights. Second panelist is Neth Dano, who is with us again. So she is the co-executive director of the ETC Group. ETC Group works with a wide range of partner civil society organizations and social movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And it investigates the politics of new technologies, particularly in relation to their implications for the world's most impoverished and vulnerable people. At ETC Group, Net's own research focuses on issues in agriculture, biodiversity, climate change, and wider environmental governance, particularly in Southeast Asia, which is where Net lives, in Mindanao, the Philippines. And part of the reason we're having connection problems is because she's in Mindanao right now. And in her free time, Net enjoys reading, crochet, sewing, scuba diving, wall climbing, and exploring new places with her friends and family. Finally, the third panelist, Patrick Mulvaney, based in the UK, is an agriculture and food policy analyst, focusing on policies and practices to realize food sovereignty and enhance agricultural biodiversity and agroecology. He was an active participant for many years in the UN civil society lobbies on agricultural biodiversity, as well as in food sovereignty networks. Patrick's first job, way back in the early 1970s, was with peasant organizations in Honduras. And from the late 1970s, Patrick worked with ITDG, now known as Practical Action, until just about 6 years ago. Currently, he's an honorary research fellow at the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry, and he's a member of the Food Ethics Council. So that was the distinguished group of panelists, and I am going to kickstart the discussion. So introduce the session with a brief introduction with something written by Gandhi in 1909 in his classic book, Hind Swaraj. I quote, "It is my deliberate opinion that India is being ground down, not under the English heel, but under that of modern civilization." And as you know, with the wide range of problems facing the world, many of them seemingly insurmountable, this could be said to be true of surely, I believe, in India, and perhaps also of the wider world, which is being modernized more and more and more as we speak. Concerns obviously range from toxic pollutions of air, water, and soils to the disposition of precious dregs of land and other resources remaining with indigenous communities around the world. Accompanying problems of modernization include, of course, widespread hunger, inequality, poverty, increasing frequency of extreme weather events, desertification, acidification, deforestation, and now, obviously, a global pandemic. For each of these problems, modern civilization has one answer. One miracle cure, one preferred solution, its own technology. New technology, preferably developed in laboratories and test sites of a large corporation, often with subsidies from a government or two. Technology that can be a smartphone app for commodity trading, or an in-situ sensor for monitoring crop growth, or obviously genetically modified plants and animals. So in this session, we ask what makes these technologies, if anything, colonial? Is it the concentration of their developers and promoters in some parts of the world made rich by colonialism? Is it the dependence on these developers of poorer regions that were, and in a few cases, remain colonized? Is it the technology's forceful substitution of alternative knowledges and techniques considered indigenous or local? Is it their design, perhaps, aimed at achieving mastery and control of nature? Is it the extraction of land and other resources accompanying modern technologies from people classified as traditional and backward, or people whose worlds are still colonized? So, leaving with these questions, I turn to my panelists for further discussion, beginning with Ruchi.
Thank you so much, Saurabh, for that introduction, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'm sorry Dr. Shiva couldn't be here, but this is a very important discussion, one that has also been going on also on the conference over the last days. And now, as the crisis we face increasingly intertwine, and with the excuse of pandemics and lockdowns, the temptation to look for immediate solutions through technofixes to all our complex problems is becoming even more prevalent, without any regard to the social, political, economic, or ecological impacts. And how it's happening is this top-down application without any agency for the communities that it is being imposed on, through an aggressively imposed consensus between multiple actors, whether it is big corporations, with governments, with philanthropies, with research institutions and international institutions. And we have seen, as to answer one of the points of what Saurabh said, what makes this colonial, throughout history, we have seen iterations of multiple actors coming together to implement different waves of empire through economic expansion. And so what we're also seeing right now is a convergence, not just if you look at food systems, not just within big ag, but also biotech and industrial agricultural giants with financialization investment firms and philanthropy, all and big data and big tech all coming together to push this new digital agricultural technologies under the guise of food systems transformation. And what it is resulting in is an aggressive push towards false solutions, ranging from artificial intelligence and predictive algorithms to fake foods such as lab-grown meat and synthetic oils and biofortification to solve all our climate and malnutrition problems, or robot pollinators to combat mass extinction, which the industrial agricultural system caused in the first place, or gene drives, as Saurabh talked about, in order to preserve agrobiodiversity and in order to preserve agrobiodiversity. And if we still continue to talk of food systems, we know that our current models are failing. But the industrial agricultural model has been forcefully imposed in countries all over the world through the narratives of the civilizing mission of the Green Revolution. You know, you have these packages of miracle seeds with pesticides and fertilizers, which were sold under the guise of feeding the world. But it is always the same tired argument and justification behind when it was imposed, that it is countries in India, countries like India in Asia, or countries in Africa or Latin America, they are behind because they do not have enough access to new technologies, or their seeds are backward and poor and thus need to be improved, or their farming practices are backward and inefficient, and that can only be remedied through industrial agriculture and its technological advancements. And the same dynamic is also seen within the country, as we are seeing with India, where economists who have probably not picked up a seed are telling farmers what is good for them, as if farmers don't know what is good for them. And we know that the Green Revolution model has failed. Far from feeding the world, it has destroyed biodiversity, marginalized and erased traditional methods of farming, and essentially created a fossil fuel dependent agricultural system in the hands of big corporates for expanding their market for seeds, pesticides, and chemicals and GMOs. But not only is there a continued delusion and distortion of the success of Green Revolution, but it is being exported by the likes of the Bill Gates Foundation, as Agra in Africa, as was spoken about a few days ago, and newer iterations of these technofixes are being perpetuated throughout the world. So, but this discourse is obviously always the same. There is this warlike mentality of single targets that need to be conquered, and making all past failures irrelevant or invisible. And what it ends up doing is destroying all types of diversity a diversity of approaches, a diversity of movements towards food sovereignty, etc. For example, you have Bill Gates' his private investment firm, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which features other billionaires such as Jeff Bezos and our own Indian Mukesh Ambani and Richard Branson, to help the world reach zero emissions. And they invest in companies like Pachama, which produces technology to modernize forest carbon markets and use machine learning with satellite imaging to measure carbon captured in forests. Or you have C16 Biosciences, which create conflict-free palm oil to combat climate change, and which is basically using a new form of synthetic biology to essentially brew completely artificial palm oil, and greenwashing themselves in the name of climate change reduction. And so, in other words, this same rhetoric of this humanitarian effort, but it is barely hiding the priorities of the expanding corporate profits through market expansion for these new technologies. And the other example is Ag1, which was launched in Jan 2020 and is called AgTech for its implementation in Argentina, which is essentially a data generating agriculture, which is using sensors and satellites to supposedly lower the use of chemical inputs and gather data points on anything from mapping soil moisture to weather patterns to soil nutrient levels to individual plant health. And the end purpose supposedly to fill the data gap of the global south and provide data as a resource to build maps and predictive models of agricultural systems. So what this is doing is essentially reducing farmers to mere data points, or the world's diversity to merely an environment to improve predictive models with complete disregard for living systems. And the other important part is that in countries where Ag1 is looking to operate, there is very little legislation or regulation or concrete agreements around digital data transfers, leaving countries in the global south with little capacity to handle this new influx of data resources, and leaves them even more vulnerable to further predation by large corporation. And this is what colonialism does. It extracts surplus values through an extractive and exploitative relationship, whether it is with nature or seeds or traditional knowledge or workers and farmers, and then creates profit by what is stolen or shut down. And then it dispossesses people, farmers, from their lands and from their territories and from their rights. That's what colonialism does. Or along with that, with the hubris that not only can you predict nature, you can control and manipulate it without consequences. And that is where technologies like geoengineering and gene drives come, which I'm sure, ETC has worked a lot on. And not only are these new colonizers content with colonizing Earth, we have people like Elon Musk proudly proclaiming that they would like to colonize Mars, using the word colony as if it were a great thing. And I think the last point that I would make is not, and this is something that was also spoken about in a discussion a few days ago on philanthropy between Rupa and Raj, that it is also the colonizers who define the historic narrative. They write the laws which serve to legitimize this sacking. And this trend of shaping narratives is also shaping how we think about problems and solutions, and erases complexity and alternative ways of thinking, knowledge, and cultures. And this is why the resistance to this distorted worldview, where technology has become a holy grail to solve all our complex problems, is so important, and especially with the food system. As everything around us now gets increasingly artificial and mechanical, food remains the last frontier. So at least a large part of agriculture is still done by hand. There is a connection with hand. We still prepare food by hand. And thus you see an even more intense push towards digitalization in food and agriculture. And I think it's important to remember that we don't need the sci-fi horror film reality to solve our complex problems which have been caused by such technologies in the first place, when we have the solutions in our hands through biodiversity, through agroecology, by keeping biodiversity in farmers' hands. And I think we'll talk about this more in the session. I'm sorry if I've taken more time. Thank you.
No problem, Ushi. Thank you very much. Neth, may I ask you to, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well, Saurabh. I hope you can hear me. I know you
Yes,
cannot
very
see
well.
me.
Yeah, that's
Anyway,
unfortunate, but we can
like
definitely hear
my
you.
internet connection is really so bad. You can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Okay, with some delay. So I think that that's a very interesting question. Why this technologies colonial, and Ruchi has run us through many of the facets of this technologies being colonial. And I would have to just focus on a few that are to complement what Ruchi said, and also to introduce some other elements. I think one very of the colonial is, of course, the aspect of domination. And if you look at the food systems, and also uses technologies such as digital and precision agricultural technologies in the food system, like the interest behind them are actually largely large corporations, giant transnational corporations that have become fewer and larger throughout through the decades. Um, as we are speaking right now, we actually have just largely four giant corporations that are dominating the agrochemical markets, commercial markets globally. So you have largely Bayer, you have Corteva, which is the Bayer, actually incorporates Monsanto. You have Corteva Agrisciences, you have merger of Dow and DuPont, and you have Syngenta, which has been bought up um, by ChemChina, which actually merged recently with Synchem, which is largely the world's biggest chemical industry. Um, and of course, all these players that dominate the seed and agrochemical markets globally are up in the north. They are bigger and fewer, have become bigger and bolder throughout the decades, and they have actually bought up the small ones, including regional and national seed companies, both struggling and also medium size, even big size companies at the regional and global level. So this aspect of becoming the dominant force that owns everything, that actually bubbles everything and swallows everything along the way, is is a hallmark no of what we say as a colonial aspect of these technologies. And these companies not just this seeds and agrochemicals, but also the technologies that are being used and promoted to advance towards agrochemical or seeds. And more, we're actually seeing convergence of these industries pertaining to life, with digital technology companies, including not just farm machineries, but also drones and the hyperspectral imaging. And Ruchi has also alluded to that. We're actually seeing a lot of partnerships, collaboration among drone companies, hyperspectral imaging companies, together with these big four companies that dominate the seeds and agrochemical market globally that I mentioned. It's actually even more dramatic if you look at the investments, for example, of big tech um, in the food, like advancing digital applying it to food systems. There are some interesting examples, particularly in China, where you have Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Netflix all investing on the food and agriculture industry, in particular hog raising, and promoting themselves as the cleaner option in the producing for for not just for the Chinese market, but globally. So some may find it funny that you have like CEOs and that is coming out with a promotion of clean pigs that their companies are raising in their also in the general market. Also, there's this aspect of the colonial where you have the colonial working with their representatives in developing countries, and in particular, like we have seen how national and regional, supposedly public institutes are willingly and generously lending their names and their image and reputation to promote corporate-backed technologies and claiming these are national research and development. And we've seen this for example, in the case of vitamin A rice, the so-called golden rice, where the promotion and development are actually advanced by public research institutes that are funded for corporations that own the patents and proprietary interest on the technologies that are involved in golden rice, for example. And it's also I think to raise also the fact that I think has already talked about this, that it's important to emphasize that technologies are colonial in many sense because they actually bulldoze what exists on the ground and ignore the knowledge systems and innovation of farmers and indigenous communities that have existed for centuries, that have actually allowed the development of resilience among communities, and promoting monocropping and uniform and top-down technologies that come mainly from the formal systems. All these informal knowledge that have provided the backbone for community innovations, and also development of local technologies and local knowledge systems are actually being ignored and bulldozed. So I think I would just raise those three as a response to Saurabh's questions. And sorry for taking up that longer.
No, you didn't take too much time at all. Thank you very much. A lot is lost in this process of promotion of modern technologies, around the world. So much knowledge. In fact, if you just look at a proxy for lost cultures, for example, is provided by the loss of languages around the world. And if you just look at the death of languages that has been happening in the last 50 or 100 years, it's in fact, last 50, 70 years, in fact, more from during the colonial era. So, it's like the post-colonial era is more harmful, it seems like, what existed before, obviously, in some ways, in terms of the environment, in terms of lost languages, and the process has only intensified. Now, before I move to Patrick, maybe there is another question here posted by one member of the audience, and perhaps that's something you might want to include in your discussion. Well, but what is, yes, we know all of these problems associated with technofixes and technologies and how they are colonial, but perhaps there is a saving grace about these technologies, something that we can salvage, something that they do which is positive for the world that needs to be taken into account here in our discussion. I don't know whether you want to speak to that, but that's something on the table right now. In addition to whatever you want to say, Patrick, of course. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ruchi and Neth, who really described very clearly, I think, what the challenges are and how we need to think of this in the ways that Sarah has introduced. Just in parentheses, Sarah, ETC Group produced a wonderful map about 10 years ago of the world's languages and the loss of languages, and overlaid that with the loss of local knowledge, local seeds and so forth. It's a brilliant map. I don't know, Nath, if it's still available, but if it is, it's well worth looking at. It speaks volumes, that particular map. But I think what I'm here to do is really to add to what Rishi and Nath have been saying, and try and recognise that that in the UK, we know about this. Indeed, this Oxford Real Farming Conference has had many sessions which have articulated very clearly these problems, and so it's not that we don't know about it, but we do need constantly to be helped and reminded to reflect on the past and our present role in colonial domination of economies, societies, and ecosystems, especially through technology. And I think what Oxford Real Farming Conference this year has done so wonderfully is to sort of hold up a mirror to ourselves and get us to reflect upon this in order to strengthen our resistance and to strengthen our solidarity. I mean, you know, we have quite a legacy, an imperial technology legacy. And of course, it is imposed by entrepreneurs, by buccaneers, by colonial officers, private sector adventurers, and we disrupted societies and ecosystems in our colonies, producing benefits that some of us still enjoy. So it's a long legacy. There's been a lot of discussion in this country about slavery, Black Lives Matter, and so forth. And that traffic of humans has been horrendous. But accompanied with that, of course, was the imposition of production systems, monocultures, plantations, and so forth, which caused so much problem, and still does. I mean, just to bear in mind, and I take on the question that you raised, Sarah, which came in the chat, that there's a lot of work being done in science and technology and research in the UK. And actually, if you go back through lots of the sessions in this Oxford Real Farming Conference, there is a wealth of information about the innovations and practices that farmers here in the UK and in the global south, with their native seeds, a wonderful description of native maize varieties yesterday in Ecuador, the brilliant discussion about the role of fungi by Merlin Sheldrake last night. Lots and lots of good work is being done. However, in the export-led quest for profit, a lot of public money is invested, as you were describing, and Nath as well, is invested in science and technology, mainly sort of biotech type science and technology. In fact, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and its business ministry that controls most of the public spending on agriculture and food security research, I think it's more than $200 million a year. And it supports the dumping of these technologies in the global south, especially gene technologies. And of course, as Rishi, you were saying, and that's being exacerbated by corporations and donors with complicit acceptance of governments. But there's almost nothing in the spend in the UK on agroecology research. It's minimal. There were sessions by Nina Merla, Michel Pambert, both from colleagues from CORE, from the Centre of Agroecology, Water and Resilience, that spelled out it's a minimal number of percent, depending how you calculate it. So the question must be, why is it that we're not making use of this wealth of information, particularly that information of the skills, innovations, and practices of the farmers in the global south? Why are we not building upon that and enabling that? There's no shortage of knowledge, especially in the global south. And there are some who say that it's not necessarily that they want to be told what to do, I think there's a confusion that there's some imperial view that we have new technologies, wonderful new gizmos, and we must show people how to use them. Very well described by you, Ruchi. And some people say we don't need to be told what to do. Just get off our necks. It's a way of thinking that we need to absorb and try and try and think through how we can better support those processes which can help to restore the ecosystems, restore the biodiverse seeds in the global south, help the majority food providers. I mean, we got here through the plantation economy, spreading the plantation economy, the conversion of military technologies to agricultural technologies, often for biocidal purposes, and now agroecology being promoted by some of the World Economic Forum associated coalitions, the Food and Land Use Coalition, for example, which is heavily contaminated with GMOs and other fourth industrial revolution technologies. There have been some noble struggles over the years, and for those of you who know their history a bit, remember Albert Howard and his Agricultural Testament, where he fought against the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium lobby, the NPK lobby, as he used to say, to show that in India there are ways of being able to do things, and people were producing well, healthily, and very sustainably, but that was being eroded by the NPK lobby. I think eventually he was rejected by the British establishment. There's lots to say, and so what's different now? I mean, what's different now is that there are lots and lots of new gizmos, but what we could say is it all coming back to bite us, and possibly quicker than ever before. The old saying, as you sow, so shall you reap. And in fact, the founder of Oxford Real Farming Conference, Colin Tudge, wrote a wonderful book in 1993 called "So Shall We Reap," in which he reminds us that the impact of modern technologies and capitalist agribusinesses on the food, biosphere, and livelihoods has been very negative, and could still be unless we have a renaissance. And he also reminds us that agriculture is not a business like any other. It beats to the drum of biology. And I'd add to this by saying that we need to recognize that we humans are part of biodiversity with which we have co-evolved. And at the lots of sessions in this conference about that. We need to nurture and dynamically manage in situ the agricultural biodiversity above and below ground and in waters that colonial technologies seek to dominate. So there are a number of processes going on at the moment, and we can talk about those a little bit more, and particularly in the Q&A. Particularly would shout out for the UN's Food Systems Summit, which is happening later on this year, but it's biodiversity, climate change, food security, and so forth. And there's a lot of work to be done around those to try and get this form of thinking so well expressed by the EPES Food, by Hans Herren, by Vision, by many organizations, including yourself, Ruchi, and Neth. But I think just finally, I'd like to say we should remind ourselves that our government's global governance systems prop up these patented technologies that are designed to dominate nature, and they facilitate through subsidies to their export to the former colonies for profit, with serious impacts on food provision. Just one example. Peasant seed systems, those wonderful biodiverse, heterogeneous peasant seed systems that they are accepted as collateral damage in the global governance of seeds. We really need to have a different kind of governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. That's absolutely true, Patrick. We need a different kind of governance for all sorts of reasons, including stopping the onslaught, but also for encouraging, promoting resistance, and wherever possible, perhaps appropriating what works and negotiating with it in a way that is not harmful, which is what a lot of the discussion is from the chat room is also pointing towards. So I want to move to the question of resistance, because none of this goes unresisted, obviously. You know, if there is an onslaught from any side, even nature resists whatever we inflict as modern humans on it. And obviously people around the world, people whose lives are taken over, people whose livelihoods are destroyed, people whose lands are dispossessed, whose resources are compromised, obviously resist this process of techno invasion from all sorts of quarters. And I want to turn to Ruchi again to discuss some of these mobilizations for resistance, which are, for example, right now in India, extremely active, particularly in the north, the so-called Green Revolution belt of India, as far as beat is concerned. Ruchi.
Thank you, Saurabh. Before I get on to the resistance, if I would just also add and agree with what Patrick was saying and the comment that you made about technology. Are there any benefits to it, and should farmers not use these? Because it's linked to the resistance part too. I think one is not against technology on its own, but one mustn't forget that it's a tool which needs to be evaluated democratically. It's not a religion or the holy grail with which we can just solve problems without discussion or without evaluation of its context. And the part to remember is that is who controls it, who has access to it, what happens to the data that is generated from it. Just like seeds, who controls it, who has access to it? Are seeds better in the hands of farmers, or are seeds better in a gene bank controlled by big corporations or philanthropists like Gates? So the problem is not that the point is not that we shouldn't use technology, it's here. But it's a tool, and it's a means to an end and not an end in itself. And what the other part that we forget or get distracted by these do-good narratives is, at the end of the day, a large part of it has been about market expansion. And we forget, with this dominating imposition on our communities, we forget and erase the alternatives that are there, with the people, and this is where this is the view, the paradigm that is also the resistance. Instead of the distorted view where we are viewing a fossil fuel dependent agriculture which uses more resources to produce goods that we consume, defined as productive, or the devastation of ecosystems and biodiversity collapse just brushed away as externalities, and the system being called efficient or progress or progress. That paradigm and that distorted view is being challenged, and is challenged by small farmers and gardeners and seed savers throughout the world, which are implementing this agriculture or agroecology, as we call it, by preserving and developing their soils, their seeds, and their traditional knowledge. And they are feeding communities with healthy and nutritious food while preserving the planet. So we don't need to go to war with the planet. We can live with nature, work with nature, and find the solutions to the problems we are facing. And that's the paradigm, right? That that the future is based on these diverse agroecological systems and working with nature. I've been fortunate enough to learn from and ally with people's movements in India, whether it was the Adivasi movement in Chhattisgarh against Green Hunt, or the movement in Orissa against the giant steel plant, South Korean company called POSCO, which was led also majorly by women and children, and they did not allow for the company to put a brick for almost a decade, and they won. Or the Niyamgiri struggle in Orissa, and the communities know why their mountain is sacred. They know that they do not want to. They will never give up their land to become slave labor to mining companies. They know they are more prosperous. They know why they cannot just let their mountain or their rivers get destroyed. And so our challenge, I think, is to connect a lot of these seemingly disparate struggles, connect the local to the global, connect geographically, connect issue-wise, right? We keep saying we shouldn't be in silos. But a lot of us end up still being, even within a single issue networks. How do we connect these together? And as the work and what Patrick talked about, and perhaps we will take this in the question and answer session too, that as the talk and the discourse on food systems transformation goes on, and the attempt to take over that discourse and to appropriate even terms like agroecology, our work is to deepen this ocean of agroecology movements that is developing, and resist this corporate co-option, and that will happen when we learn from each other. And just like the farmers movement in India right now is a beautiful example of what mutual aid looks like, and how different groups come together in solidarity, and they don't allow one group to just fight on its own. And I hope, and I think Saurabh knows more, can even speak more on the farmers movement in India. But I hope in India that is becoming increasingly dark and increasingly repressive, that we are that this movement, which is lit a beacon of hope, infects others, not just in India but throughout the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruchi. Indeed, that movement is the hope on our horizon here. I'm currently in India, so that's the hope on our horizon, because all the other hopes, they keep on extinguishing them. Unfortunately, there were many hopes flourishing before the pandemic. Okay, I want to move now to Neth for some stories from the Philippines in terms of resistance, perhaps, or from elsewhere in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world. Neth, please.
Thank you, Saurabh, and thank you, Ruchi, for kicking off the discussions on this area of examples of resistance. And I think it's very important to highlight that particularly in Asia, Southeast Asia, have never been passive towards, or have never been passively accepting colonial technologies, like the example of Green Revolution technologies, that despite the billions spent by the North, by transnational corporations and venture capitalists pushing for the Green Revolution from the 1960s, there are actually large areas in Southeast Asia, like in particular in the Philippines, that not just because they were not reached, but also resisted the introduction of modern, so-called modern high-yield varieties to replace traditional varieties, and also the introduction of chemical fertilizers that have actually for decades have adversely affected soil quality and also nutrient quality of food in general. Like as presented in one of our flagship publications in DC, despite all this aggression using technology as a tool for aggression, we are still in a present where 70% of the population are dependent on the food produced by peasants, by small-scale farmers, by artisanal fishers, by food gatherers, and even urban gardeners. And the issue is this is not recognized officially by many brands, despite the fact that even FAO has recognized and even raised it to 80%, at least 80%. That's what the FAO says. At least 80% of the world's food is actually produced by small scale producers. despite this recognition by FAO, there is this continuous assault on food debt and this highly delusional promotion that it's actually industrial agriculture that's feeding us. So I think the step towards resistance is really to expose this and to challenge that propaganda about the role of industrial agriculture in feeding the world. Like, I think we should really be far more aggressive on the role of industrial agriculture, destroying biodiversity and destroying agriculture, the real agriculture. Also, it's very important that despite the aggression, using subtler tools such as loans, programs for marketing, also credits that roll into them new technologies, including green revolution technologies. Like in many parts of Southeast Asia, it's still a practice among rural banks not to extend loans to farmers who are not using green revolution technologies. Despite the revolution, this is still the practice of many banks in Southeast Asia. But despite that, like civil society and more organized farmers networks, farmers movement were able to establish cooperative and microcredits that actually provide support for farmers who are still promoting and using diverse diversity in the farm, and also traditional farming practices that are much more sustainable and much more appropriate in farmers' conditions. And as mentioned by Ruchi, like it's also very important to note that to aggressively push open that idea that technology is a tool. It's not the holy grail. It's not a manna from heaven. It's a tool that is being used to promote colonial agenda, whether you call it being used as a tool of aggression. And it's very important that in this push for using technology as a tool for aggression, that we protect the spaces for innovation, for farmers to continue innovating on farm, and in their communities to be able to discern, also interrogate technologies that are being introduced, particularly through government programs, interrogate which technologies are useful and appropriate for them. It's not just an issue of accessibility, but also critically interrogating technologies, not just in terms of short-term benefit, but also long-term impacts and implications on livelihood, and the environment and biodiversity in general. So yeah, I'd like to highlight those points.
Thank you, Neth. Indeed, I totally agree, and I also think that we need to think about resistance in a way that takes into account the fact that there are not just global alliances, but also local alliances between different movements. In relation to that, in fact, there is a question in the chat box from somebody complaining about XR, Extinction Rebellion, and how Extinction Rebellion has no accountability in terms of where it gets its funding, which I have also, in fact, struggled to find out where. I have actually looked and searched where Extinction Rebellion gets its money from, and I have also struggled to find what the sources are. And it, at the same time, tries to sort of wriggle its way through grassroots movements, which is what the question is also pointing to, and disrupts those grassroots movements often by hijacking their agendas. So the person is saying, we don't need XR in India, we don't need XR in the UK. But perhaps Patrick, and of course I want to go back to Ruchi and Neth as well, the role of these global movements that come in, that are becoming more and more prominent these days, and how they disrupt local place-based struggles that people have been waging for very, very, very long time, considering the long history of colonialism in many parts of the world. Patrick, let me begin with you on some of these.
I'll very briefly respond to that, but perhaps we can take that forward to the Q&A afterwards, because I think it's a very
Absolutely.
discussion to have. I finished just before by talking a little bit about governance and building on what Ruchi and Neth have been saying about global movements and social movements and so forth. I think we should shout out and recollect that the Committee on World Food Security was completely renewed in 2010, and it has a civil society mechanism which is dominated by social movements, particularly Via Campesina. And Via Campesina for the last 20 years has been very active in developing what is now agreed United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And those are, for me, the legitimate social movements. Those are the legitimate actors. And anything else we do should really build upon that experience, not to try to colonize it and replace it. The second thing I just want to remind the audience about, it all seems a bit hopeless and what can we do? Just to remind you that about 20 years ago, we in the UK successfully fought off a public relations action by the cabinet, by the Prime Minister and the cabinet, to roll out GM in the UK in the name of arresting hunger in Africa. That we had to have GM here because it was necessary in Africa. And we got a very strong coalition of organizations, all the large development organizations, your Oxfams and Save the Children, CAFOD and so on, together. And we managed to fight that off, and it killed that for at least 10 years. So we can do it. We did it then. We ought to think about ways we can effectively organize now to not allow, as Ruchi was saying earlier, the development of these things in the name of climate change or stemming biodiversity loss or solving the nutrition crisis, whatever. The technologies for those are known. People are there in the field and able to work with nature in ways that provide healthy food, low carbon or zero carbon, or even negative carbon, and importantly, retain agricultural biodiversity. And the final point I just want to make, Sarah, if I might, is that
yes.
one of the things that has been really strong in this Oxford Real Farming Conference, it is to show that the resistance in the UK is not just coming from, in quotes, environmentalists. The government and media often say, "Oh, people don't like gene drives or whatever." It's some environmentalists who are complaining. No, it's not. The greatest opposition numerically to the colonial exploitation, expropriation, and to the Technofixes and the fourth industrial revolution technologies are the hundreds of millions of small-scale food providers who still feed more than 70% of the world's peoples. They are the peasants, pastoralists, fisherfolk, and so on. The same people whose lands and territories, pastures and savannas, waters and fisheries were destroyed by the colonizers, along with their highly heterogeneous agricultural biodiversity they nurtured and the collective rights they enjoyed. There's a lot of work going on in the UK to bring that to the fore. Oxford Real Farming Conference has really demonstrated that there is a massive resistance. And indeed, activist researchers, for example, in the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, are looking to work with social movements in be able to support them in their quest to be able to fight off some of this colonial domination, this neo-colonial domination. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Indeed, very, very important. Neth and Ruchi, I mean, we've got very little bit of time, but I do want you both to, come back for a minute each, if that's okay, before we conclude, because we can, of course, take some of the discussion, most of the discussion forward in the Zoom group that we're going to set up after this session. And if Kushal, the volunteer from the conference, if you could please post the link already from Zoom that we are moving into for the discussion in the chat, that would be great. And maybe post it again, and I'll remind you again in 3 minutes. But quickly, 1 minute each for Ruchi, and then we wrap up and move to the discussion in another room. Ruchi, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, I look forward to going to the breakout session too, but just very, very quickly, I mean, I agree. I agree. There is no one way of resisting. There is no uniformity. We are opposing uniformity, and there cannot be a uniformity in our approach to resistance either. We need a diversity of voices and a diversity of approaches, and this is really where also we are trying to, as another international, trying to work towards. Even when we work on food systems transformation, that we believe that there is no one actor that can take work purely towards a transformative agroecology. Eventually, it will need to involve multiple actors, and we are working on the ground with these approaches, even in Italy, with projects like the Biodistriti. But I look forward to discussing this later. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruchi. Indeed, the diversity of movements, diversity of people in those movements is so important and cannot be underemphasized at all. Neth, please.
I think we cannot overemphasize the importance of providing space and recognition for evaluating technologies at different levels, both at formal and informal levels. First, by creating mechanisms such as technology assessment platforms that involve different sectors to look at entire technology, the potential impact on different aspects of society, the economy, and culture. Also, we have to allow and support the efforts of communities to do their own interrogation at that local level, which may not be structured, but would allow them to look at usefulness of technologies and also evaluating the impact at the local level. It's not just an issue of economy or accessibility. We have to really give recognition to the standards and parameters given by communities with regards to adopting technologies, because there is this general academic view that rural communities in particular are resistant to adoption of technologies without giving consideration and also recognition of the parameters and criteria set the communities to look at technologies and evaluate what are useful for them and what they can adopt at the level. So also highlight, like the effort of ETC Group in creating a platform such as assess.tech, tech.org, which audience one look up, in providing information on efforts of civil society and local communities and social movements on technology evaluation.
They are coming with a lot of knowledge and wisdom of alternatives, of ways of doing things that have been undermined and called all sorts of names in the past and continue to be called. Their knowledge is never really taken seriously. So I think resistance has to be in that sense situated in this quest, in this preservation and protection of alternatives such as agroecology in many different forms. So resistance is not just an opposition, it's actually a constructive, creative process of producing alternatives and enlarging the space for such alternatives indeed. I would again request Kushal to post the Zoom link for the breakout group for further discussion. We've got a lot of questions from the different members of the audience, for people participants of the conference. I have most of those questions with me copied here. So I think if it's okay, we can move to the Zoom room already, perhaps Kushal can post the link again here at the bottom in the chat function, and we can quickly just click it and go to the Zoom session. Thank you. It's 1 o'clock, so we are bang on time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ned. Thank you, Ruchi. Thank you for being on time, for keeping it brief and very useful and informative. I have learned so much in the last hour. I wish I could have all the hours of my life like this. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you.
Bye. Bye, Patrick. Bye, Ruchi.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Onet, you aren't able to join us, right, in the Zoom session? Oh, okay.
Oh, I think we have to get out of here now.
Okay.
You copied all the questions, right?
I've got the questions, so we can just go to the other side.
Perfect. Thank you.
I need some light in my room. Okay, bye.